Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sagar. I am here along with my colleague Janvi and Phela. We are POCs for this session. So I hope you had a great lunch and are feeling energized as we have now a very insightful and engaging session ahead. That is failure in translating biodiversity policy into localized action. So this session is in partnership with Ashraya Hastha Trust, a philanthropy founded by Mr. K. Dinesh. He is a co-founder of Infosys and his family. Since 2000, it has supported over 100 grants in healthcare, education, environment, livelihoods, and animal welfare, impacting communities over 26 states. We are honored to have Sonya Fernandes as our moderator today. With over 17 years in the development sector, she has led major philanthropies and grassroots initiatives across India and South Asia. Currently, she is the Chief Program Officer at Ashraya Hastha Trust. Please join me welcoming Sonya. So without further delay, let's get started. Sonya, over to you, please.
So thank you everybody for joining us. I know, when we were thinking about having a panel around biodiversity policy, the only thing that came into our mind was the COP16, right? And we had a lot of mixed responses from the COP16. Some good, some we are still confused about what it was. But certainly, there was one thing that stood out across all COPs is that biodiversity was not really given the focus that it should, right? And IPCC reports, and I think we've also heard Rohini speak, we've heard Harini speak, right? IPCC report, focuses on climate action and mitigations and clean energy solutions and everything that is exciting to us. But the biodiversity section in itself, which perhaps is the most important section and perhaps the most tangible one, because we can actually see where we can head and there could be actionable plans in the section, right, which were not really spoken about so much. There are global frameworks, right? We've got the global biological framework that was set up, right? And also India has been signing up to different frameworks. So what we said is that in this panel, we're not really going to speak just about failures, right? And failures not, while the panel says policy, we said that we will focus on policy as a potential gap, but let's also focus on failures in action that could have happened a long time ago. 34 years of the framework that existed, right? And we had 34 years, and 2020 was a time that we had to translate this into action, and we missed that target. So let us perhaps in this panel, speak about the entire gap in the implementation, the fragmentation that exists within the ecosystem, right? And also what are the hopeful points for the future. So this panel is I think to a certain extent, certain amount of hopefulness in it, right? Understanding and being cognizant on where we failed, and like Rohan said, maybe we are all complicit to it, right? And we should also take like collective ownership towards it. So keeping that in context, I'd like to perhaps, give a little brief about each of the panelists. What I'll do is I will start with Sujana. Maybe you can, speak about yourself. But Sujana is a good old friend and a very good partner to us. So we support their program, and we're very happy to partner with their program called UTMT. And this program is a very interesting program. It's about the entire adjacency between pollination within working with the tribal communities and livelihood. And I think there is no way it could fail in any sense, but somehow there are barriers there, right? So something as robust as this seems to be also struggling. So Sujana, over to you, a little bit about you, your work, and the program, and maybe also a little bit about the pollinators that you work with.
Thank you so much, Sonya. So actually all of us are collectively very happy that you're here and not there, because we know that there's a lot of, session is in huge competition with the MEL session. So a collective thank you from all of us. So like Sonya mentioned, I work with Under the Mango Tree Society. So we are an NGO that primarily works in the states of Gujarat, Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. So when we're a young NGO in the sense that we were set up in 2009 with a concept note and a pilot and all of that. And how did we come into being? Adivasi communities, as all of us know, are generationally familiar with bees. Because the tradition of bees is something, they say the gun of bees, the sound of bees, they can actually identify colonies. So on the one hand, you have communities which are generationally familiar with bees. On the other hand, they practice smallholder farming. And we all know that there's been a decline in agricultural productivity, especially for smallholder farms. So here we were in the middle of this conundrum, if you call it, and we realized that bees could actually play such a huge role in terms of improving agricultural yields for smallholders. So where were the gaps? One, the fact that all of us, even me before I started work with Under the Mango Tree Society, associate bees with honey, yes. But the more important role that they play is that of pollination. So 4 out of the 5 foods that we eat, vegetables, fruits, oil seeds, pulses, forest ecosystems, all depend on bees for pollination. Cotton, timber, all of it. So in fact, when the world was, or rather the scientists of the world were trying to get attention to bees, the huge statement was there would be no coffee, chocolate if you didn't have bees, or even cheese, because dairy animals require the fodder. Plants require bees for pollination. So that's how critical bees are. So the gap that we realized was the government was working, let's say the beekeeping programs in the country were actually working with a hybrid bee, which was not very sustainable. So that was one big gap. The second big gap was that the training programs would be conducted, they would say that you should be like 12th pass, take everyone to a particular training institute and train them, which means that people who had the traditional knowledge about bees were completely being excluded from these programs. So that is actually what we sought to bridge at Under the Mango Tree Society by fusing traditional knowledge about bees with small little things which science gave us, like a bee box. And we realized in many places, Sanjeev and I just now were talking about why our program failed in Melghat. It was because we realized that this was a later learning in the program, that you need to analyze the floral cycle in a particular area. There needs to be enough food in terms of nectar and pollen for bees. And with deforestation, many areas were actually devoid of adequate flora. So by adding all of these components, a bee box, training in the local language, today some of our best master trainers are women from Adivasi communities who have not even gone to school, but they're excellent trainers. So by making training programs extremely women friendly or people friendly, having training about beekeeping at farm gate, adding components of kitchen gardens which help the floral gap, that is the way that we bridge this gap between traditional knowledge and beekeeping. And today we've seen on the field that bee boxes, today we work with only indigenous bees, apis and locally available bees. So having 3 to 4 bee boxes on a small farm can increase your yields for almost most things that a small farmer grows between 30 to 60%. And that's a huge increase because in income terms, it puts almost 16 to 20,000 rupees per annum into smallholder farms. So I'll stop there, Sonya, and
Yeah, so thanks, Sujana. I think that's a great way to start. At some point, we'd really like to also build in the entire biodiversity component into pollination, because we're doing a couple of programs around pollination. But to actually see where it's heading, we also need data, right? And then coming to you, Saloni, and you're from A3. Right, and I think data, M&E, evidence is at the core of everything that you do, right? So Saloni is basically a researcher and environmental anthropologist at A3 who's committed to global, I'm going to read this out, okay, because it's a little complex, is committed to advancing global sustainability effort by complementing scientific rigor and compassion and empathy. And what stood out to me was compassion and empathy, right? While scientific rigor is an important component and a lot of researchers look at it in isolation, connecting that with communities, connecting that with culture, connecting that with behavior change is an important aspect that a lot of researchers are now turning to, right? So we are hearing a little bit about action-based research, which is a phenomenon over the years. So it'll be great, Saloni, if you could, introduce your work, yourself, and your thought process and ideologies around it.
Yeah, so I'm actually, I don't know which label to use because I'm a product of multiple disciplines, but loosely I'm a conservation social scientist, and I work as a fellow at ATRI, which is based in Bangalore. But most of my work is in Ladakh, which is a trans-Himalayan landscape in India. And I've had actually through my journey as a researcher and researcher/practitioner, I've kind of come to realize certain limitations of the lenses that I've used in the past, and I'm kind of trying more and more to have a more integrated approach. So started out mainly looking at, as a naturalist, field biology, then kind of actually originally starting out as a student of English literature, then moving into sustainability, and then biodiversity conservation, and then finally ending up as what I call a conservation social scientist. And what I realized when I was working in Ladakh throughout my PhD days and before that, a lot of my work's focus was on certain charismatic species like the snow leopard, the wolf. These are flagship animals, not so much wolf for other reasons, but certainly the snow leopard. And I spent a lot of time trying to speak with communities, understand their perceptions of these animals, because these animals are often a cause of great distress because they, feed on livestock, and, that creates a lot of economic, psychological kind of impacts on people. And while I was speaking with them, and I focused a lot on the snow leopard, and one of the objectives of my research, in fact, was to document cultural relationships. So I looked at folklore around these animals, assuming that because they are these charismatic species, there is bound to be some folk literature. And through my journey, I think there was a lot of unlearning to do, and Rohan and I were just talking about that, because I think I came in with a certain disciplinary bias, because I said, okay, A equals B, I mean, there's snow leopards, therefore there'll be some kind of folklore. And when I started speaking with people, the first thing many of them told me is, why are you asking us about the snow leopard? Like, there isn't much reflected in our culture about the snow leopard. There are very few stories or songs. You much rather ask us about species that matter to us, which is the ibex, which is what we call a prey species of the snow leopard. Because we have much closer relationships. They are part of our ritual, they are part of our customs, they're part of many of our songs, etc. And then along the way, when I spoke to more and more people, I realized that the issue was not really just, even if I had understood perceptions towards these carnivores, somewhere I would not have fully understood how they're embedded in the culture of the place, because it was a very complex web of relationships and interrelationships between people, species. There were no dichotomies between what humans were and what animals were. There was, in fact, no word for nature in their language, right? So there was a lot of unlearning to do, and through that journey, and then over the years with multiple collaborators from various other disciplines, we kind of developed a project. We're currently in probably the starting out phase, I would say. We finished the pre-prep, but essentially we're looking at rangeland conservation, which is important for species, but it's also important for people, because we're talking about pastoralist communities here. And so how can we look at rangeland conservation and pastoralist well-being in a more integrated manner, going away from specific species, going away from specific problems, to looking at more structural and systemic issues. So that's really the current focus of the initiative that we've co-developed actually with pastoralists in this space. And I'll get to more details as we go along. Thanks.
Thanks, Aloni. I remember speaking to you or Rohan, I'm not sure, about this entire approach that we have towards species conservation, right? And I think we're also trying to get to a more comprehensive conservation method, because while we keep species at the center of it, there's a whole ecosystem, right? And this entire panel is actually about both species and ecosystem conservation. So we could speak a little bit about how is there a change in that, right? And is policy actually enabling that change, or is policy still stuck in the past while communities and researchers and CSOs are moving ahead of it, right? So keeping that in mind, getting to Rohan, who really wants to speak about it. Rohan, a little bit about you before you can get into your introduction. So Rohan is another good partner of ours. He works with the Nature Conservation Foundation. He's founded the Nature Conservation Foundation. He's very passionate about marine and coastal. You speak to him for hours about Lakshadweep, and he will never cease to bore you about it, right? I'm joking, right? But it was the most interesting conversation we had with him about Lakshadweep, about the challenges and about the passion. So I think one thing that stood out for us is that while in many spaces there are people working in it, in the biodiversity space, the passion is quite intense, right? And I think the passion drives a lot of work in this space. So Rohan, over to you, a little bit about yourself, your work, and yeah.
Okay, I hope not to bore you too much.
I'm joking.
Okay, I won't say too much about, I work with the Nature Conservation Foundation, which is an organization that works across different landscapes and geographies in India, where we're trying to imagine a world in which nature and humans can flourish together. That's a bold claim. It's very difficult for us to actually achieve that, but that's what we are hoping to do. And I suspect that if I look at the almost 30 years of work that I myself have done as a marine conservation biologist in this space, I think I'm eminently qualified to speak in a session about failure, because I think my entire life can be dictated by essentially that sense of failure. And since 1998, 1996, when I first started diving in coral reefs in India, first in the Andamans and then in the Lakshadweep, what I have seen is a 50% decline in the coral itself. This is like losing 50% of the forests of the country. Most of it is not known to most people, but that's the kinds of losses that we've been seeing. Just last year itself, we had another major El Nino event, which is this large ocean warming event that comes across the Pacific and then the Indian Ocean. And whatever gains we've had in the last 10 years of coral before that, we've lost it once again. Now, to put that into context, what does that mean? It means that for places like Lakshadweep, where I work, this really calls into question the very habitability of these islands. How long are these islands going to remain habitable? And the way it works is linked very, very much to biodiversity, but it's also linked very much to what Sujana was talking about, which is biodiversity translates into function. I mean, biodiversity is not valuable in and of itself, as many conservationists would like us to believe, but it's valuable because it is valuable for people. And it is protecting various essential functions that the ecosystems deliver. In a place like the Lakshadweep where I work, which are low-lying coral atolls, the coral is important, yes, but it's important because it generates calcium carbonate. It has a certain accretion potential. It is essentially a calcium carbonate factory of producing cement. And that capacity to continue to buffer the island as a result by producing cement and protecting the atoll, that in itself is reducing with time. And what this means is that for the 70,000 people living in the Lakshadweep, the next 20 or 30 years is likely to be uncertain. We don't know whether these islands remain habitable because it has downstream effects for land stability, it has downstream effects for food security, it has downstream effects for water security. And when you don't have land, you don't have food, you don't have water, your islands are not habitable anymore. So what I'm studying in relation to biodiversity has very, very direct links to human survival on places like the Lakshadweep. And in the last 30 years, I have failed completely in being able to actually figure out ways in which we can conserve these islands and conserve the biodiversity of these places. And when thinking about this in the context of this conference, I was beginning to wonder what this actually means. And I think primarily the reason that I believe that I've failed is because of the way we frame our questions itself and the way we frame failure itself. The assumption that we have when we are talking about success or failure is that we know what it means to succeed. And what I would put to you is that actually we don't know at all what it means to succeed. I think the framing ideas framing these problems in the context of failure and success, I think in itself is a false binary. Sometimes these problems are so complex and so wicked that we need to do, what Donna Haraway, who is a famous eco-feminist, calls, stay with the problem. Sometimes the problems are complex, we need to stay with them. And sometimes acting alone will only take us down into palliative solutions, which philanthropists and impact assessments would do really well with actually measuring, but it doesn't actually have much effect on the ground. I'm saying this also in the context of being completely open and,
Yes.
And what I would say is that the reason that we don't know what it means to succeed is that we often don't have the baselines. And that baseline basically, on the one hand, looks at an ecological baseline. In terms of knowledge, we don't have the knowledge baseline of what we are losing, particularly in the marine field. This is particularly true. But I think that we also have our baselines wrong. Because I keep looking at the Lakshadweep and think about 1996 when I first saw them, and that was my Edenic baseline to which I hope the coral reefs of the Lakshadweep are going to get to. The honest truth is I'm fooling myself. It'll never get back there. The onslaught of climate change is so large that it doesn't matter what we do at the local level, it is not going to get there. And so keeping my baselines back to a point in 1996, and telling myself that the crisis is imminent, and that in the next 5 years, if I don't do something to either satisfy a funder or to protect the people on the islands, everything is going to collapse. I have spent the last 25 years doing that without actually having any success at all. And I think that what we really need to do in this is to put our baseline somewhere else. I think we need to put our baselines out into the future. We need to put our baselines one generation out into the future. And when we do that, we might realize that actually we may be able to see this as functional minimums in terms of what are the bare minimum functions that this system needs in order to continue to remain habitable. If I were to reframe it like that, I might think a little differently about what exactly can I do? What can I do in one generation that I can't do in 5? Who do I need to convince? And then I'll realize that the people sitting in those desks, at the back of the desks, those old bureaucrats, are not the people I need to convince. I probably need to convince the people who are going to be the bureaucrats of the future. I need to be speaking to members of the community who are going to be affected by this 30 years into the future. We don't do that yet. And I don't think that we have the tools or the instruments to be able to convince people that that's what we need to do. So that's the first thing, that I think that our baselines are wrong. I think that we often don't have the scale right, that we don't know how to match the scale of our impact with the scale of the problem. We would like our solution space to be small and hyper-local, and that's extremely valuable. But sometimes the scale of the problem is so large that those small level effects are not going to work for the scale of the problem. It's not going to address the scale of the problem. And that's a really difficult thing. And finally, I'll say that we need to have eventually the courage to call the crisis by its name. There is an elephant in this room, and that elephant is the elephant of growth. And can we call out growth as the real crisis? If growth is the ideology, is the basic ideology by which we are running the world, then it doesn't matter what we do. Everything that we're doing is basically just putting a hand in the dike. And what we are always asked to do is to find optimism and to find optimistic solutions. But in the face of the crisis, I think we need a whole lot of realism as well. And one part of that realism is to call out the problem by its name. If you call it out, I think we'll be able to find solutions. There are solutions there, but we need to be able to have the courage first to figure out what the problem is.
Thanks, Rohan. Yeah. So, I mean, it seemed that a lot that you emphasized about was the 30 years of experience in Lakshadweep, and how there was a certain amount of helplessness to see that deteriorate over time, right? where and it wasn't that helplessness came out of the fact that we didn't have the means to do it, but it was basically us working with one hand tied behind our back, right? So then coming to you, Rishikesh. So a little bit about Rishikesh. He heads the Habitat Trust, and I had the opportunity to speak with the Habitat Trust for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and what I realized is that the organization or the philanthropy is quite ahead of its time, right? And I was telling Rishikesh that this is one of the few philanthropies that have actually got practitioners built in, and the grant makers here actually do know what they're doing and what the focus is, and they're building it with grassroots organization at the center. He will also speak, I think you could speak a little bit about the implementation programs that you have on ground, which is very interesting. While I realized that there is a feeling about funders getting into, or philanthropists getting into implementation, but there is also a space that we come from saying that if we don't understand what are the pain points of implementation, we will never be able to frame our philanthropic goals well, right? Or we will not be able to build up on programs, right? And that's the space that some of us come from. So a little bit about the Habitat Trust. It was founded by Roshni and Shikhar, and it tackles biodiversity loss, climate change, and water scarcity. It has got over 80 programs across the 32 states. And they've also made several films that you should speak about, please. Right, over to you.
Thank you everybody for coming. It's quite a full house almost. So before I tell this, I must tell you what happened to me first thing in the morning. A phone rang and I picked it up, and it was a friend and said, where are you now? And I said, I'm in Bangalore. They've invited me to speak on failure. The first thing he said, right person to call. Like, friends, I don't know how do you deal with them. But so I'm going to take a cue from him and say, I'm just going to talk and also from what we've been hearing the whole morning. And I'm going to talk from the perspective of a failure, much like Rohan did, but slightly differently maybe. So what is failure? Failure in our space is that you decide your goal, outcomes, outputs, you lay it out in a matrix. The report says you've achieved it all, but nothing really is achieved. I think I'm too close to the speaker or something. Yeah. And what we, like Rohan said, like a lot of external factors is what has not been incorporated, and we fail. But the Habitat Trust is approaching it differently, at least we would think it is different, are we better than what we were yesterday? Yesterday, if we were at a certain point, have we progressed from that point rather than seeing where we want to go and then not reach there from that spot? And that journey has been about finding your equilibrium with all the factors that interact with you. And that has been done just by focusing on relationships. Your relationship with your vision, your relationship with your stakeholders, your relationship with your internal relationships with your patrons, people, the landscape, all of that. And what you've realized is focusing on that has given us more insights on what to do and how to be better than yesterday, then deciding where you want to go and set out a chart for you. So people are, so what are you doing next? And I'm saying, I don't know, I'm going to do something better than I did yesterday. So don't ask me what is our next plan. It will all depend on what we did yesterday. So this is a side event, and biodiversity events are always on the side, right? And that has been our failure. Because we've made it so niche. When we speak, I'm not a scientist, thankfully, or not thankfully, I don't know. But what I say, no, not because scientists are bad, because I would have been a bad scientist.
You're making it worse now.
Just my mother doesn't know what I do. Forget the world, what to explain them. And that is not her failure, that's my failure. We've become so niche that you only think about it on a Sunday morning if you wake up early. Let's go watch a bird or something. So what at the Habitats Trust we are trying to do is align ourselves to what is the general narrative. I mean, we've been hearing since morning listen to the community, stay with the problem, and it's all about alignment. Whether you go out and decide what you want and be a shark or whatever you want to call yourself and then fail, or you say, let me understand what the government wants, what's their perspective. What does biodiversity we think needs, or what the people want. And when you go do that, you realize that it's not just these three stakeholders, there are several other stakeholders that actually influence your work. And if you can somehow get them to talk to one another is the first step, but work together. Easier said than done, but possible, because Habitats Trust today has 130 partners. Those partners are Indian Navy, Indian Army, Indian Coast Guard, Army, except Air Force, speaking with all of them. We are talking to ministries, we are talking to CAs, we are talking to sports personalities like, say, Abhinav Bindra, who won India's first Olympic medal. He's our partner. To a lady who's working in her backyard to save the river from the sand mining, to a filmmaker, I can keep going on and on. There are 130 plus. So I can keep going on about but to kind of see, it's not a common agenda, right? When you try to find a common agenda, what we have realized and that's our failure when we first started to look at what's common between all of us, let's do that. What we realized is my priority might be at 80 on that common agenda, your priority might be at 5% on that. And then nothing really moves. And of course, and I take the blame for it, and I'm being recorded, so please forgive me, we conservationists really don't like each other. And not in terms of people, we love each other, but we will have our perspectives and we will not like the other perspective. So what we've realized is that doesn't work again, and what you really need to do is find that alignment, so that what Adam Smith would call as the invisible hand or whatever starts working on its own. And that magic has been seen happening at the projects that we do at the Habitats Trust. So we started as a philanthropy, looking at giving money. From there we started doing our own projects with partners. And with partners, what we said is, what you can't do is what we will do. I don't know, we were very arrogant. And then we figured that, now we have said it, now we have to do it. So that's how we said, let's look at coral reefs. You can't go beyond 40 meters, let me go beyond 40 meters. And that's how we sent the first rover to 100 meters to look at what's there. Other partner said, Hulok gibbons, we don't know how many there are in India. I'll say, we'll tell you how many there are. And then we figured bioacoustics, and we've come up with a model now that isolates Hulok gibbon vocalization from the ambient forest sounds. And now we are seeing if we can identify the groups based on those sounds and stuff like that. So being naive or being arrogant has led us to come up with being better than what we were yesterday in many such solutions. And that's how we've ended up working with the Indian Navy and Indian Navy climate change and whale connections. All of those we looked at, and scientists told us that whales are dying. One of the reasons why they are dying is the sonar pinging that the Navy does. So now we've submitted a report on how Indian Navy can do pinging responsibly. Hopefully on 13th, the Chief of Naval Staff will announce that we are taking these measures. We've given them. So you just try to be better and better and better every day, rather than, we didn't set out to say that we will tell Navy what to do. we set out to see where's the alignment between Navy and us, where's the alignment between biodiversity, or the whales and Navy and us, and the ministry. Ministry here came in the Ministry of Military Affairs. So we've kind of finding that in the process of finding that equilibrium where somebody's share might be bigger than the other, but everybody can form some equilibrium that gives out better results. And films you said, but in the process we also said we'll produce films, and we produce 190 films so far in multiple languages, 25 I think. These beautiful filmmakers made films that have won national awards, and I don't know, I think 8, 9 other awards now, and we continue to get them. But what we are now trying to do is, how do we now become from an alignment to the mainstream alignment? And that's where now we are in talks with, say, for example, in Lakshadweep, where Rohan's work has helped us a lot, is to how do you develop islands, which Rohan actually said 30 years down the line, how it may look in a way where now we are using principles of biomimicry, we are looking at ecology, we are looking at better tourism models, we are looking at regenerative models, stuff like that, where we are also talking with Maharashtra government to look at whole Vidarbha region of how you can ensure not just corridors but livelihoods of people, marginalized farmers. So you come up with an integrated development plan. That's what we are writing so far. So from giving money, our journeys through failures have made us reach a spot where we've been better than yesterday by now not talking at all about biodiversity or using the word conservation at all. We have reached a point where we are now saying that in the given context of climate change, biodiversity loss, aspirations of, you work in Ladakh, you know how the aspirations have changed over the years. Those local people, youth aspirations to, wanting to be a 5 trillion economy very soon. Where is that alignment, and how we can be a solution provider in this whole context? And that is what the Habitats Trust, through its failure. So we don't really look at failures. Failures is if you play a finite game, that there is a start and an end. We believe that if you play an infinite game, where every day is an iteration of your last work, there is nothing like a failure. So that's our perspective.
Yeah, my perspective too. I'm joking, but I think what stuck with me is the fact that you said that biodiversity conversations still stay at the sideline, right? And I think one of the good goals from this entire thing is to not let that happen in the future, right? And to try and see if we can build in more conversations around biodiversity, the work that's happening, the work that researchers aspire to, the role that policy plays right now and how policy needs to evolve through it, right? The places where policy has stagnated and let us down, the places where philanthropy has let us down, right? We need to start having these conversations more in the open. While I also understand, Rohan, when he spoke about growth, right? Keeping growth also as a part of it, right? Because the aspirations of the human race is never going to slow down, and there is a whole pull and push between biodiversity, conservation efforts, protection efforts, development, which need not be that pull and push, right? We are more intelligent to figure out a way, we're just not collectively intelligent. So I think we should try and see if there is this collective intelligence that comes out of it and collective will that comes out of it to basically iron out this entire differences that researchers have, not entirely, at least say that, and philanthropy is also facilitating that process of saying that while differences exist, it's healthy. It is not okay to say everybody is going the same direction because we all agree, right? Because the very essence of human race is differences, which allows us to evolve. So keeping that differences not at the center of it, but being cognizant of it and saying that let's try and align on certain things that would basically see us heading, maybe through different lenses, but heading in a particular direction. We should try and see if that's possibly a long-term goal. At least I would, go back with this as an action point for us. In the process, I might forget also, so I'll have my team to remind me that there is something that we need to remember. And yes, totally thrilled that you wake up and see the birds in the morning on a Sunday. I wonder if you see the bees and Rohan sees the sharks, right? Okay, so coming to Sujana, and I know you spoke of volumes about livelihood and um, about the pollinator cluster and the entire journey of developing this entire programmatic model, right? At the same time, also, I remember you saying that policy is just not catching up with it, or policy is not understanding how important pollinator clusters are in the ecosystem. And also, very interesting thing about the hybrid bees that you spoke about. I didn't know that there were hybrid bees, all right? So it scared me to think that at some point we'll be hybrid. So we've got a lot of hybridity in the ecosystem. So how are indigenous communities actually protecting that in their own way? And if protecting it is the right way, or is it okay to say that, okay, there are hybrid species or there are invasive species, they're anyways going to be there, right? And they're going to anyways choke the biodiversity up. There's very little we can do about it. Is that also a space that we are getting into?
Thanks, Sonia. Actually, I was just going to come to this. Also in terms of the push and the growth factors and the push and pull. I think what's worked for our model is the fact that we've created an economic incentive for conservation in the communities that we work with. So that has been a huge demand factor in terms of creating more demand for beekeeping with local bees. So that by itself, so you have communities now taking pledges that we will work only with indigenous bees. So even if hybrid bees are sought to be pushed in because we are interested in the honey by various agencies, communities have decided to keep them out. So I think that creating an economic incentive has been a very good part of what's come out of the last 15 years of our work. Now, in terms of policy, so two weeks ago, I was quite shocked when, I was talking to a fairly senior official at the Ministry of Agriculture who said, show us the evidence. So I was thinking that why should we show you the evidence? You run ICARs and such a huge network of institutions which should be giving you the research. But then I said that, okay, it was our failure probably that we have a very strong M&E team, I hope they're listening in, who are constantly looking at yield increases. So it was our failure that we haven't put this knowledge out into the open. And one of the things that we will be doing over the next 1 year is putting this knowledge out into the open, number one. Number two, I also feel that, incidentally, I should mention that since we are in Karnataka, it's the only state which has a state insect, which is the honeybee. So there are states which are doing their bit, but even in Karnataka, if we talk about what are we doing about conservation of bee species, there won't be much work, and that is, I think, where people like us need to step in. And this is where we spoke about collaboration. I was narrating the story to Varsha in the morning that when we received a mail from Ashraya Hastha Trust some 3 years ago, we thought it was an April Fool's joke, honestly, because we said, okay, who actually, which organization in Bangalore would actually find us out? But yes, that's the collaboration that we've now worked out. And I think this is the space for more CSOs, more philanthropists to come in and maybe give the evidence to the government. And we know that there are people sitting there who are willing to work with you, and provided we all go down the same path together. This is another axe that I have to grind with academia. Academia has done very little research on indigenous bees. It's the story that this morning Anshu was talking about, the technology about the coconut. Have we really gone there? No. Today our communities tell you that there are so many varieties of stingless bees. But sitting in Bhopal, ISER, we've not been able to convince ISER Bhopal to come to Chinwara to actually do the scientific research around it. So I think these are conversations that we need to have. And I actually feel very positive, like Rohini says. There's a whole bunch of things that all of us can do sitting together. We don't need the government to do it now. We have enough strength and power and intention to move these biodiversity conversations up front and keep it center stage now. So I think that's one key takeaway for me.
So glad you said that, because I was actually thinking at some point, do we need policies at all, right? But I think, Saloni, it will be great if you could respond also to Sujana's, the point on academia, right, and the role of academia in research and building in this entire know-how. At the same time, speak a little bit about the innovations and the failures in innovation, and also with respect to policy from your context.
Well, to respond to the point about academia, actually it's point well taken, because I think there are these silos between academia and practice, between disciplines, between sectors, and often the language and the vocabularies that all of us use are so different that sometimes it's a chasm that one is not able to cross. So unless there is an active intent and a will and some action, it's really hard to bridge that chasm, I feel. And in terms of innovation, and I want to also respond to several other things that were brought up earlier about how we view failure, and also this link between innovation and failure, because again we tend to look at failure as an absolute thing, as the end of a journey, so to speak, right? Like by the end of 5 years, a donor would want us to tell them what was the successful parts, like there is an M&E, where we list out all the success indicators and things like that. But there is actually no room to talk about failures, or let's just call it learnings or iterations, as Rishikesh put it. And I feel that there are two things here. So from my context, where one is looking at biodiversity and human well-being, and that's the context that most of us relate to and agree with, that they are not two separate things, but perhaps two sides of a coin, right? So that is anyway understood mostly. But I think the approaches that we employ to understand this linkage and to build this linkage is very different, and there is no singular approach. What I would like to flag here is whether we are more focused on the outcomes of this kind of integration of human well-being with biodiversity conservation, or are we also looking at process? And this is again something which Rishikesh brought up earlier, because I think oftentimes we don't pay enough attention to the process of how we got to a particular outcome or an output, or whatever, our log frame, so to speak. And that is where I think a lot of differences lie. That is where I think researchers will not agree with other researchers, or practitioners and researchers might not agree, right? So I feel like we have to really focus on, how do we, for example, look at disagreements? How do we look at, when we are talking about iterations, when we are talking about learnings, how do we want to homogenize, or do we want to retain heterogeneity, both in terms of approaches, perspectives? Do we want value alignment in the sense that there is a certain value that everyone needs to align to, or is there room for different kinds of values? I think we really also need to pay attention to the differences. And I mean, humanity, as you pointed out, works fundamentally based on differences. So I think we should move away from a singular idea of what biodiversity conservation is, or what human well-being is, to also be able to be open to multiple ideas or multiple concepts even within that, depending on the context, depending on the place, depending on the social and the political milieu in which all of this is performed, in a sense, right? So that's one. And I feel that in terms of the need to communicate these integrative approaches, we really have to start focusing on how far along we are on the journey of conservation and social justice, because they are not two different things. They're allied, right? So can we create a body of evidence towards that end? What will that evidence look like? What are we calling evidence? These are all questions to think about, both from an academic perspective, of course, but also has repercussions on practice. What are the boundary conditions of a system? That is something sometimes we don't understand. Like Rohan said, the scale of the problem and the scale of the intervention are very different, and they're also very dynamic. So they keep changing. So just when you feel like you've had a handle on it, something else comes up and throws a spanner in the works. So how do we deal with that dynamism? How do we accommodate things that don't go as planned, which typically we refer to as failures, but I really do not see them as failures. But coming back, Sujana, to your point about academia and practice, I do really feel that there has to be more dialogue across actors, and by practitioners, not just bureaucrats and policymakers, but also how do we incorporate a bottom-up, community-driven kind of an approach? That is something I often ponder about. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so community-based approach is what I think is at the center of it, right? And we've been speaking for a while about how this entire connect between CSOs, policies, community, and the entire policy and funding frame can actually build this narrative for us. So Rohan, over to you, maybe to just deconstruct that a little bit for us. Is there a possibility of these three linkages happening in the biodiversity frame, and how is funding actually going to help build this together, or is funding the right tool to do this, or the right segment to do this?
That's a tough one. Okay, I mean, eventually I think that perhaps the reason for philanthropy in the first place, I think, is that potentially that governments and civil society have abandoned certain spaces. And if they were working well, if the government was doing what we expect a social democratic government to be doing, if civil society was functioning well and its institutions were functioning and they were healthy, I suspect we wouldn't need philanthropists to come in, which doing things out of the generosity of their souls, with their wealth and all the rest of it, based on what they think are objectives that are of primary importance to them. And so I find it difficult, I think, to know how to answer a question like this. I do believe, though, that if solutions come from someplace, it will come from civil society. And it is, and we've been dancing around this for a while, in this conversation and in other conversations as well. We recognize that civil society is critical in being able to get to some kind of resilience. Civil society will need help, and civil society needs help for one reason, that many of the institutions that have been designed, that have been designed through an evolutionary process, are probably not going to be fit for purpose when it comes to the kind of uncertainty that awaits us, or that we are going through right now. Because they're designed to, taking into account the normal variability that we have experienced over the last 10,000 years or so, since the agricultural revolution, but the way that has been ramping up right now, that uncertainty is much, much more than many of our civil society organizations are designed to accept. There's a huge amount of response diversity, and I think we need to celebrate that response diversity, because that response diversity translates to resilience, okay? And that resilience is being weakened often because of benign or malicious programs, okay? Subsidy cultures and all the rest of it work to reduce response diversity in institutions. Okay? For instance, knowledge about traditional knowledge systems. Having all these traditional knowledge systems, being able to document them and preserve them is useful to preserve the entire set of responses that are going to be valuable into the future. But what we're expecting into the future, we don't often know, because the amount that ecosystems and social ecological systems are so discontinuous that if we go over that threshold, we don't know where the bottom is. And I'm not sure whether the institutions that we have currently are designed for that. So I think so civil societies are going to be where the solutions lie. Okay, we need to do our best, I think, to document, preserve, and support the resilience that civil society organizations have. But I think we will be needing to do much more than that. How we get there, I have no idea. I'm not the right person. I don't have those skills. Perhaps Rushikesh with his technology, which might be.
Yeah, data and technology.
So that's the other thing I wanted to also say. I don't think, and I say this very firmly, I do not think that we can engineer ourselves out of this problem. I don't think it's just a question of, this is not just a question of finding the right technological solution. This is what got us here in the first place. And just to think that artificial intelligence or some new fancy technology is going to help us get us out of the problem, no. It will help us document the decline even faster.
Yeah, I agree to that. I completely agree, and it is a very morose situation, like documenting the decline. But I mean, just a thought that came into my mind, and while I'm completely gung-ho about civil society partners and this entire community-based interventions and building community knowledge and information to empower them, right? At the same time, I mean, both to Rohan and Rishikesh, because this is a question that I'm also grappling with, is that are we putting a lot of onus on communities and civil society organizations, right? We're saying that they will sort it out, communities know best, we will empower them, they will figure out the solution, right? Whereas, policies as simple as the coastal regulatory zones, right? When coastal communities are perhaps empowered to a certain extent to conserve the coastal, ecosystems, has been there for a long time, but it's still not working out, right? And that's a policy that actually is a strong tool that has been debated around in several forums, but we still rampantly see coastal declines and growth and development taking over coast, right? So what is happening there?
Completely agree with you, and I grapple with this because people come to us and say, "Ke, ye kara do technology se." So that doesn't work, and that brings to what you are just asking about. Is it too much burden on civil society and the communities? When I was a kid, I would not study because it was difficult. So I think we still do that as a community, where we want a silver bullet. Do one thing and things should work out. Community will find a solution, civil society, philanthropist, just one person doing something, or government will make a policy and things will get sorted. It doesn't work like that. And it's been repeatedly shown that it doesn't work like that. Does that mean that civil society and communities can't do anything and they shouldn't do so, hence not do anything? I think that's not what I'm trying to hint at. I think we have to understand that it is complex and fill in as many cogs and bring them together and see if they can work together, and then keep adding to it. And if you are asking for a quick fix solution, 1 point solution, it's not there. So that attitude of trying to find the simplest or doable solution, and that happens to a lot of people. Now I am in a place where we have philanthropy and we can give out money, but 90% of my career has been on the other side. And so you tend to write proposals where the funder will understand what this is. You tend to simplify it, break it in phases, break it in projects after projects. I know some who do a 50-year plan. I'm amazed how they do that. But they do that, and then you don't get a solution, right? And then you say we failed. And then what it actually does is give it to the communities and nothing happens. So communities don't work. Bring in a law, it doesn't work, so law is useless, and implementation cannot happen. But nobody really thinks, what all do you need together? I think I'm going in loops now, but yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, you've completely confused me. Right. But I think I've just got an open question for the panel, and then maybe we'll open up. We've got 15 minutes. So yes, the question is at the core of it, the failure at the policy level, but also most importantly, I've also heard you all say in different ways that the philanthropy space is looking for quick fixes, right? So basically it's looking for impact within 1 year and 2 years, whereas ecosystems don't react, are not something that will give you an impact in 1 year and 2 years, right? So how can we unravel this? How can we build this entire dialogue with the philanthropy space? Because of course it seems to be stuck in different places. Like the SESOs are struggling with communicating this to the philanthropy, and the philanthropies are pretty much not moving, right? Whereas the CSOs then move to a certain extent to try and see where we can build in certain amount of understanding in the two spaces, right? So I think this would be a good place to address it.
Yeah, great question. And I think the way CSR funding is moving now, it's on a year-to-year basis with huge amount of compliance. Philanthropies are actually the way to go. So it's like what economics calls patient capital. So, if there are policy changes that you want, and today you see policymakers asking us for the evidence, so then this is the philanthropies really need to have, and this is an earnest request, long-term views. We can't move from one donor to the other every 3 years, every 4 years. It's very exhausting. And somewhere it takes away from the work that you're doing also, if you're constantly chasing. So this is where I feel that a number of philanthropies like Ashraya Hastha Trust are far-sighted, but we need more philanthropists to do this kind of work. And also probably invest in building institutions. Today the days of the Tata Trust, investing in organizations are gone. So maybe the new philanthropists need to kind of factor in some of these things and in the way that they work. As a medium, we are not a small organization. We've been around for 15 years. One of our biggest challenges is to even build a corpus. We have like 3 lakhs in our corpus because nobody wants to give to a corpus. So I think somewhere institutional building is something that I would earnestly request philanthropists to look at, and also developing a longer term view in terms of, because you can do that. Today we are in a situation where CSR funding cannot do that. In principle, they give you a commitment for 3 years, but still you're submitting annual proposals. And if there is a change in leadership on the top and the global priorities change, you're gone. It's very difficult. So those are some asks, if you want to call it, from our end. And I think I'm sure I speak for a number of civil society organizations here in the room.
I have the opposite problem. So, in the sense that, A3 is an old organization, but the initiative me and my team are working on is pretty new, and there is no proof of concept. So we've had donors, large donors, who essentially don't believe in the idea, because in fact, many people around me who I've known for a long time struggle with how we are imagining this, because, we're looking at decolonial approaches, we're looking at building M&E from bottom up. That means that there has to be a certain dynamism and adaptiveness built into it. There has to be room for the unknown, the unpredictable side of things, because priorities change. What is valuable to people probably is not quantifiable in the sense that a donor requires, right? So we've had a real struggle in trying to sell the idea of interdisciplinarity, integrated thinking. And when I say interdisciplinary, it is really interdisciplinary, because we have on our team visual arts curators, we have somebody who works on gender, we have anthropologists, sociologists, agroecologists, we have community members also contributing their traditional knowledge. So we are trying to find a least common denominator, a common language that we can use to communicate to the donors, and yet somehow, because the idea seems so, it doesn't fit a particular sector, so it's neither fully biodiversity conservation or is it fully development. It's very hard for us to have a proof of concept for it, and if there is no funding, we can't have the proof of concept. So it's like a chicken and egg kind of a situation. Until we actually met a donor that was interested in something that's exciting, something that's kind of out of the box. So I feel like while there has to be a long-term kind of understanding and support from donors, there should also be willingness to experiment and space to experiment with things that are not the norm and things for which there is no proof of concept. I feel that maybe that's where some new ideas might emerge.
I'm a big believer in subversion. And I think that, I have learned, not very well, but I've learned that to be able to do the work that we do, not because of the funding, but despite the funding. And so, funding agencies require certain impacts, they require certain reports, they need certain things to be in a particular way, fine. But some of the most important work that my team has done is that for the last 28 years, we've been monitoring the coral reefs of the Lakshadweep, and not often do we get funding for it. We often have gaps in funding, nobody wants to fund that. But it has been the most solid piece of work that has contributed to our understanding of how reefs across the Indian Ocean have functioned. So I think subversion plays an extremely important role. Often, to convince the funders that you need not a lot of money, don't give me a huge amount of money, but give me a small amount of money for a long time, okay, is actually much, much more difficult to convince funders to do. To fund institutions, again, is a very, very difficult thing because it's just not sexy. Okay, it's not sexy enough to say I supported the operations part of this particular institution. It's not going to happen. And so I think subversion becomes important in that as well, somehow or the other. But I think that I would also put a little bit of the onus on scientists like us. I think that we do tend to sit in silos. And the reason that government agencies are not able to speak to the scientists and scientists are not able to speak to government agencies, it's completely natural that we have this mismatch between what is there in policy documents and what the science is doing. We don't have a language in common. We don't have a forum in which we can speak and even find that language. And we don't have a place where we can discuss something even more important than the facts that determine the case, but the ideologies behind it. Because eventually that is what is making the decisions about what policies are being implemented in these locations, what monies are being spent. And eventually those ideologies are where we need to spend a bit more time having, sitting a little bit more, being a bit more reflexive about those ideologies, because whether we like it or not, those ideologies affect me. They influence the way I do my work. And so it's very, very natural that the ideologies are affecting the other people on the other side as well. The one thing that I will say, and this is something as a lesson to myself, is that whether we like it or not, we will need to become more political. Because you cannot be an apolitical actor in this space. And whether we are scientists or practitioners or policymakers or whatever, community members, it is in the realm of politics that we will need to see changes made. And how we manage to navigate that is, again, a huge, huge challenge and a huge ask. But I think that's where we need to go.
I'll speak from the other side because I have the privilege of doing so. What is a funder looking at is measurability and accountability. 2 days back, I was sitting with CEO of global cosmetic brand, huge there. And we were talking, he said, what are you talking? You're making no sense. Thriving world, biodiversity. He said to me, flat, that you make no sense to me. So I asked him, then what makes sense to you? He said, I give a lot of money to breast cancer research. I know what it is going to lead to. You guys talk so many things. It is so many things. It's the world that you talk about. As a funder, it's not my job to now study what you are doing and then understand you and then tell you what you do whatever you're doing. But when you communicate, learn to communicate. And that is what he was brutal about it. So that is what I would say about funding. And organized funders are not, that's not their, even if it is their intent, they don't have the resources to understand what you took 25 years to understand, right? So now from the other side, it is our responsibility to speak that language.
Thanks. We'll open up to the audience. Any questions? Any comments?
It's a very deep question, to be honest. And like I said, I probably feel that you face the trouble once you switch sides is the same two words: accountability, reputation, measurability, all of that. I think we still, till the day we think ourselves as good doers, and we are doing good, and we are charity sorts, we are always going to be on the sideline. If we can shift the narrative to whatever you call it, we are design thinkers, solution providers, part of your growth story. Unless that shift happens, I don't think you will get the kind of investment that you need, kind of research that needs to happen, kind of importance or priority that it should get. So it's all about storytelling, I think. If you can write your own good story and shift, because otherwise चैरिटी करते तो आधे टाइम मुझे लोग समझते कि मैं झोला पहन के घूमता हूँ, राइट, that I will wear some khadi and I will have a jhola and I will hug a tree or whatever. That's the general perception. You have to switch that narrative. Not that that is bad, not to say that, but what's the aspiration, what's the inspiration, what does, so when you go to a minister, and this is from personal experience, when you go for policy, we can never touched it really. When you go, you can go with the best idea and the most workable idea because you have done all the math, you've got an economist and you've done the econometrics and you have a fabulous model, and you go to a minister, he says, very nice, come later. It's not his job, I mean, it is not his priority. And if you can align to their priority and then tell that same story with same data, and just restructure it, you have a better chance, and that's I'm telling from experience. I don't know if I answered both your questions, but yeah. And then there is a bigger shift required. If you're still going to measure GDP, you're playing the wrong game, right?
So I'll try to, I mean, I don't think I have I'm not profound enough to be able to address the second part of your question, which is basically, is sustainability possible in a inherently growth-based, market-based economy? And the short answer, of course, is no, because it's a simple metabolic thing, right? You have input, you have output, and you have something in the middle, right? And eventually, this is a story that's been about 150 years. The capitalist model has been about 150 years, and there are economists who say that they can imagine the death of civilization before they can imagine the death of capitalism. And I think that exactly has something in it, which is that it's a failure of the imagination. It really is a failure of the imagination, that there's this one particular economic model that has captured us all, and captures us to such an extent that we cannot imagine ourselves out of it. But I do believe that it is possible, if we take a clue from that, to say that if it is only a leap of imagination, we humans are capable of that creativity to be able to take that leap. And you see that happening quite a bit. You see there are movements that are occurring in India, in Europe, in many, many parts of the world, where they are reclaiming the commons, right? They are saying that these are areas that belong to old medieval commoning spaces, let's reclaim them, okay? We don't care about those the systems that have been told, and we can actually reclaim these systems, okay? They have been, these are, again, local systems which basically say that we are going to do things our own way. Eventually, I suspect that if these kinds of solutions are being formed pretty much everywhere, okay? Cooperative movements are forming everywhere, and those kind of cooperative movements are going to be the ways that we into the future. These are not ones that privilege growth, but privilege well-being, that privilege local relationships, where it's not just the human relationships that they're privileging, but also the relationships with nature. I think in those spaces, they require imagination, they require social organization, they require institutions, and they need those institutions to be hierarchical, to speak to each other, to have incredible power sharing. The design principles of those institutions, we sort of know what they should be like. But I think that we need to use a leap of imagination to pull ourselves out of that.
Just to add to that also, an allied point about why a certain economic model has gained so much traction, I also feel that it's very hard to let go of power once you've tasted it. So it's not going to be possible for people to imagine a completely alternative society, although as much as we would all like, all the people sitting in this room are massively privileged, including all of us. We are the ones talking about the rest of the earth and the rest of the people as though we have the power to completely influence their lives, right? So the fact is that sustainability and power are very closely tied, in the sense that they're inversely related, but there is a very strong element of power dynamics, power asymmetry that operates in the world. So it's not going to be possible to override that, I feel. Although in small ways can be subverted, through cooperative movements, through, people, grassroots movements and all. But really it's really difficult. And so it brings me to my other point about my first point about process, right? So, if we are talking about sustainability, why do we have to also talk about justice? Because if you don't address that elephant in the room, you will never attain sustainability. At least if you can make the process of attaining any sustainability goals a bit more just, a bit more inclusive, informed by priorities of people, then perhaps there is some hope to have a version of sustainability that people are not that averse to, or because also there is this whole dynamic of some people making decisions for everybody, and that that also means that we are losing allies, people who actually many communities do conservation, do manage resources in a way that aligns with conservation, but we lose allies when we alienate these communities. So we really have to think about all these connections as well, I feel.
Yes, so fair point. So Mellifera is perfectly suited for monoculture farming systems. So, but whereas if you try to introduce Mellifera into diversified farming systems which smallholders practice, it's bound to fail. We've seen the government dump lakhs of rupees in Dang's district in Gujarat, for example, bringing in Mellifera, boxes and boxes of Mellifera, around 200 boxes. But the flora in that area cannot sustain Mellifera, and Mellifera is what we call a lazy bee, in the sense that there are particular kinds of flora that it prefers. It does fantastically well in the mustard fields of Western MP, good Punjab, Haryana, but the same bee doesn't do it. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. So today, if you look at the National Beekeeping and Honey Mission, the only bee that it talks about is the Apis mellifera. Like the entire country does beekeeping only with one bee. We have the entire Northeast, for example, the Meghalaya. So our problem is, we can of course discuss it over tea, is that even the schemes that are being implemented by the government only fit the mellifera because the box sizes are very different. So there are states like Meghalaya, for example, which have completely kept out the mellifera because along with the migratory patterns of mellifera, you bring in diseases. Today there is also a huge amount of evidence both globally and in India. India, of course, it's anecdotal because nobody wants to document it. As to why this is problematic for Adivasi communities and ecosystems especially, which are very fragile. So that is our only contention. You do more. You're a commercial apiculturist. Please work with mellifera. There's no issue. But a small farmer who has only 1 hectare of land, you only require 4 boxes. So then you have different kinds of indigenous bees. So if you look at this is a very long story. Sorry, last point. Even the honey standards in India are actually a replication of what the Western honey standards are, which are very biased towards the Indian indigenous bee honey, because the moisture content of indigenous bee honey is very different. So fortunately, along with GIZ, we've just set up a technical committee which is going to make policy recommendations to the government on all of this. It has some of the best honey experts. But it took a civil society organization like UTMT Society to, bring these people together on the same platform and start articulating it. Because otherwise these conversations were only happening, privately. So there's a whole bunch of issues over there around it, but we should probably take this conversation over tea.
A straightforward answer to that, but that's an age-old debate, right? Like, where do you actually make change, at the demand side or the supply side? And I don't think it's either or, right? Like each one plays a certain kind of a role, big or small, and so I don't think the onus should lie only with one actor. It is kind of distributed depending on how much one is able to do. That's my only thought on the matter.
Yeah, maybe, a few questions were stuck with me also, and I think the question that the lady had raised at some point, saying that, about philanthropies, and because we are a philanthropy, saying that is philanthropy and funding the only route to make change, right? And I think that is what the question was. I mean, and concluding, right, and we'll have concluding remarks, but just concluding my thought process, I'm wondering is there a very critical role of policy to enable financing, right? And if that is possible at all levels, while there are different departments and there are different sections of it, can at least a common goal be enable quick financing, right? And not like this entire paperwork that you have to go through to access financing, whether it's research, whether it's CSOs, whether it's civil society organization. The second part is what somebody said in the morning, if I remember, is that while funding is like at the bulk on the top, it trickles down to the communities, right? So an analysis of what actually communities get access to with respect to funding, right? If we could do an analysis, a little bit of understanding, if there was like $1,000 up there, do communities access 10, right? And if that 10 is worth it, or is cooperatives or community-led movement actually better than the 10 rupees that they're getting, right? And how can then certain aspects within the philanthropy world, and I know policy is the biggest bottleneck there, right? Funding communities directly is just a big regulatory hassle for everybody across the board. So how can we actually address that, right? Because it's always looked at with suspicion, it's always looked at with certain norms with it. So how can organizations perhaps directly support communities, right? So I'm just leaving that out as a thought process for everybody, and yes, anything you want to respond to or any concluding remarks, we'll take it and then wrap it up.
I have one.
Yeah.
So I think this huge scope for collaboration, and but the only challenge is how do we get the collaborations going and working and sustaining. I think that's something for all of us to think about, because it's been a failure so far. And so how do we operationalize this successfully going forward? That might give us a lot, that will definitely give us progress in what we want to do. And also, I think that's also the way forward.
Yeah, I mean, to respond to your point, Sonya, about community directly being able to access funding, that's really something that's very close to my heart. I know we've discussed this before, but I do feel that all members, CSOs included, do play a role. They are able to bridge certain worlds which might otherwise not be possible to bridge. But I do feel more and more that, by virtue of being brokers of some kind of change, inadvertently sometimes we might end up being very colonial in our approach, right? We might look at communities, the relationships we imagine with communities might be very hierarchical, might be very transactional. And so I feel that there has to be, in the philanthropic world, an alternative model of funding through which communities can have direct access to all kinds of opportunities, be it employment, be it funding, be it any kinds of opportunities, because I think more and more, I think there's too much, the subsidy culture, for example, there's too much dependence that is being created. In fact, if you look at the USAID debates of late, there's been debates on both sides, and there is a certain acknowledgement that one has to allow people to make decisions about themselves, about their lives, and that has to be facilitated in a more just and fair manner. So I think that is the space I think one should aspire to.
I haven't had time to come up with anything conclusive and profound, but I think largely what we probably need to think about from our different spaces is whether we are truly interested and invested in systemic solutions. Otherwise, we will be moving towards catastrophe, one small palliative solution at a time. And I think that that's a conversation that we really need to have, which is about how do we get to systemic solutions if that's what we are truly interested in. I think in order to get to systemic solutions, we probably need to be a little bit more aware, or much, much more aware, to take a page from what Saloni has been saying, about where power rests, where agency rests, and who are the actors that have that power, and try to think about the actors that don't have the power, that probably would require that power to be able to effect those systemic solutions. And among those actors, I think that we should think about human and non-human actors in making that change. And if we can transform the conversation based on an honest understanding of power relations in relation to systemic issues, I don't know where that conversation will take us, but I think it's a conversation worth having.
I'll add to what Ron has said because I think he's hit the nail on the head. Also, what we're still thinking is a linear pattern. Funding, middlemen, community, impact, whatever, right? And that has not worked. And is Saloni a community by herself? Not. But you need Salonis of this world, right? They will do the research. They will facilitate the whole process of cross-learning. So to say that money is not reaching the community, it is right. But I think this, as long as you look at a linear model, there will always be a problem. And then that is where Rohan's point makes a lot of sense, that you need to look at it as a system. And there will be not just one, but not just three players in it, there will be multiple players. And communities, instead of in the chain still being at the lower end of the chain, or wherever, right, farther end of from the beginning, if you can bring them a little further up, and instead of a line, it's a circle where everybody is talking to one another, I think that may result in a better resolution of these kinds of things. So to closing comments, I think I have just, if there is one thing I have to tell you, it would be that the time has come where multiple small biodiversity loss issues that were local, like the China's panda going, or the condors going, or tiger going, all of these across the world, added with climate change, has shifted the problem. It's no longer a biodiversity problem, it's no longer a climate change problem, it's no longer a growth problem, or a health issue, or pollination issue. It's now a complex system with completely different players in it. And if you still work with your understanding of old players and try to change the system, we are not getting anywhere. So if you can rethink, and what I think Rohan has been trying to say for a long time, that if you can rethink, sit with the problem, relook at things, maybe we'll come up with a different strategy. Policies might be different so that they are more efficient. Philanthropy money will never replace government money. Mr. Nadar, Shiv Nadar, used to, said this very famously, that government is the biggest philanthropist. He is just adding, just that tiny bit to get that whole thing. It's like an oil to machinery. It cannot replace, philanthropy cannot replace the governments. So if we can look at all of this, I think there is a different world that may come out of it.
That's super, right? Just transcending out of, thinking out of, not even out of the box, but just transcending would help us so much in sitting with the problem. So with this, thank you for being such a good audience, right? And and thank you everybody here on the panel. I think we've got a lot of takeaways. I'm not going to say, put in any concluding remarks as such, but I think we've got a lot to think through about. Thank you so much.